Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can look at the mental health and personality factors that may be at work in the Dan Cooper or DB Cooper case. This unidentified hijacker committed the only unsolved air piracy in the history of commercial aviation. Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this content, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. So here I'll look at the timeline of the crime, of the hijacking, and then take a look at the mental health and personality factors. I'll also take a look at the question, whatever happened to Dan Cooper? So starting with the timeline, we move to November 24, 1971, Portland International Airport. This was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. A man in his mid-40s, wearing a white shirt and a black tie, and identifying himself as Dan Cooper, uses cash to buy a $20 one-way ticket for Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 to Seattle, Washington. He's carrying a small black briefcase. The flight, which is expected to take 30 minutes, is scheduled to depart at 2:50 p.m. There were only 36 other passengers aboard the aircraft when it was capable of carrying over 150. The aircraft for this flight is a Boeing 727-100. It had an unusual feature, an aft staircase that could be lowered in flight by a single control in the back of the plane, which could not be overridden from the cockpit. This information was not available to the public. While on the ground, Cooper ordered a bourbon and soda. Not long after takeoff, Cooper hands a note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner. She puts the note in her purse, thinking that Cooper is hitting on her. He whispers to her, "You had better look at that note, I have a bomb." I guess he wanted to differentiate that from a pickup line. Cooper opened his briefcase and showed Schaffner what appeared to be sticks of dynamite connected to a battery. He makes 3 demands. He wants the plane to refuel in Seattle. He wanted 2 primary parachutes and 2 reserve parachutes, and $200,000 in negotiable American currency. Now, there's a theory somewhat tied to this that Dan Cooper was Canadian. Another theory is that he was in the military and had served in Europe, because there was this comic book featuring a character named Dan Cooper who, among other things, would parachute out of aircraft. This comic book would have been available in Canada and parts of Europe. If we combine this with the idea that he may have used the term negotiable American currency, that seems to support the theory that he was from Canada. Now, after Cooper made the demand, he put a pair of sunglasses on, and after this he started talking to another flight attendant named Tina Mucklow. The pilot contacted air traffic control, who called law enforcement. The passengers were told that there was a minor mechanical difficulty. The plane was going to have to circle for a while and then land, ensuring that generations of flyers would now interpret that to mean there's a bomb on board the plane. As the plane circled Puget Sound for 2 hours, Cooper was able to identify an Air Force base and the city of Tacoma. So this is something that most people would not have known about. Tacoma maybe, but certainly not the Air Force Base. After 5 o'clock, the money and the parachutes were ready. The FBI recorded all the serial numbers. The money weighed about 21 pounds. The plane landed at Seattle-Tacoma Airport at 5:39 p.m. As the plane refueled, an airline employee dropped off the money and the parachutes. Cooper released all the passengers and 2 of the flight attendants, including Florence Schaffner. So that only left 4 members of the flight crew on the aircraft: the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and the flight attendant, Tina Mucklow. Cooper issued very specific instructions to the flight crew. He wanted the plane to fly toward Mexico City at no higher than 10,000 feet, while maintaining an airspeed below 150 knots. He wanted the flaps to be set at 15%, the cabin to remain unpressurized, and the landing gear to remain down. Because of Cooper's conditions, like the flap settings and the speed, the aircraft could not make it to Mexico City without refueling. So the plan was to refuel in Reno, Nevada. The plane took off at 7:40 p.m. Military aircraft followed the plane. Cooper told the flight crew to remain in the cockpit and keep the door closed. At about 8 o'clock, the crew noticed a warning light indicating the aft staircase had been opened. Over the intercom, they offered to help Cooper, but he declined by saying the word no. Likely, this is the last word he ever said, unless he had something colorful to say before he hit the ground. It is believed that he jumped out of the plane at about 8:13 p.m. because at that point the pilot had to correct for the tail section of the plane moving upward. The pilots of the military aircraft did not see Cooper jump out of the plane, but considering it was dark, raining, and Cooper was dressed in black, this is really not that surprising. The plane landed at Reno Airport. Cooper was not on the aircraft. Also missing was the money and 2 of the parachutes. The FBI did find a clip-on tie, a tie clip, and 8 cigarette butts. Now, as law enforcement tried to identify potential suspects, one individual who was of interest to them was a man named D.B. Cooper. A local reporter confused that name with the name Dan Cooper, and that's how he got stuck with the wrong name. An expansive search started involving hundreds of people. It continued on and off through the spring of 1972. Nothing connected to Dan Cooper was located on the ground during that search, despite several reward offers for anyone who found even one of the marked bills. None of the money was ever discovered in circulation. November 1978, a deer hunter finds a placard with instructions for operating the aft staircase on a 727 in Castle Rock, Washington. February 10, 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram is with his family on the Columbia River in an area called Tena Bar, not far from Vancouver, Washington. He finds 3 bundles of cash on the riverbank. 2 packets have $120 bills, and the third has 90. Ingram's parents contacted the police. The bills matched those given to Cooper. There are various theories about other evidence being recovered, but these 2 items, the placard and the money, remain the only evidence found on the ground reliably connected to the case. Fingerprints were recovered on the airplane. None of them was ever matched to a suspect. DNA was recovered from the clip-on tie. It also was never matched to anyone. Now moving to the mental health and personality factors. Cooper's interactions with Tina Mucklow, brief interaction with the other members of the flight crew, and the technical details of the crime offer the only insight into what his personality may have been like, because, again, he was never identified. Tina Mucklow described him as polite, nice, articulate, calm, and even thoughtful. For example, he ordered another bourbon and soda while the aircraft was circling Puget Sound. He offered to pay for it and give her the change, because stealing a drink was where Dan Cooper drew the line. There's a theory that he may have been in the military, specifically the Air Force. Pointing toward this, we have his knowledge of the aircraft and his knowledge of parachuting. Pointing away from this, he chose the inferior of the 2 parachutes, and he chose a reserve chute that was actually sewn shut. It was only supposed to be used for training. Evidently, it was included by mistake. Some rare chemicals were identified on the tie clip later on, making it appear as though Cooper may have worked as an engineer at a chemical company. He did not have an accent. It would appear that either he was American or Canadian, like I talked about before. He clearly planned the crime carefully, selecting an aircraft with an aft staircase and one that could fly slowly at low altitude. He selected a flight without too many passengers on it. He knew to ask for more than 1 parachute, and he knew to retrieve his note. So that note he gave to the flight attendant, he took that back. Despite his planning, he made several crucial mistakes. He left behind physical evidence. Obviously, he didn't know about DNA at that time, but it's still surprising he would leave anything behind. The jump conditions were not even remotely safe. 150 knots is a slow speed for that aircraft, but it's still far too fast for parachuting. It was also windy outside, raining, and cold. With the wind chill, it would have been below -60. He was jumping through the clouds, so he could not see a potential landing site, and he was jumping into the wilderness. He asked for a parachute that was non-steerable. He didn't ask for any other equipment that could have increased his probability of survival, like a helmet, other protective gear, survival equipment. Also, he had 2 drinks of bourbon, which is not something that would have helped him. So with all this in mind, we are left with multiple theories of mental health and personality. I will look at 2 major theories here. Theory 1. Cooper was a career criminal who bumbled the execution of the crime. So under this theory, Cooper was a psychopath with symptoms of antisocial personality disorder. He was impulsive, irresponsible. He jeopardized everyone on the aircraft. He committed the crime to get the money, so escape was his plan. And his arrogance led him to believe that he knew enough about parachuting to survive that jump. Similarly, he automatically believed he knew enough about survival in the wilderness to survive freezing temperatures and rain wearing a suit and loafers. Under this theory, there's a degree of desperation. He drinks the bourbon to keep his cool. His financial situation was dire. He was willing to risk everything to get the cash. Here he is polite because he thinks that'll help him get away with the crime. So he was manipulative. Also with this theory, he would be a loner, independent by choice, or perhaps due to his personality. So to conceptualize his personality, I will be using the 5-factor model. I remember the big 5 traits through the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So here we would see, with this theory, low openness to experience. He didn't even bother learning everything he needed to know to survive the jump. Mid-range to low conscientiousness. It really took everything he had to be as organized as he was. Mid-range extroversion, low agreeableness, and mid to low neuroticism. Now moving to theory 2. Cooper was a sensation seeker who executed the crime according to plan. So under this theory, Cooper was excitement seeking. He wanted to pull off a crime that would become infamous. He knew that realistically, he could never spend the money. It was never about the money. He also knew or suspected that he could not survive the jump. That's why he didn't prepare for the jump in a way that could have made his survival likely. This explains why he was polite and calm. There was no reason to be angry, as escape wasn't the plan. Under this theory, he would not have been a career criminal. He would have been a skilled worker, like an engineer or a chemist, as I talked about before, who just wanted to get more from life. He wanted to go out with a bang. He drinks the bourbon because he enjoys it, not because he needs it. So here he would be alone, but not a loner, perhaps someone who recently lost a spouse or otherwise was separated from his family. His personality profile under this theory: high openness to experience, his intellectual curiosity demonstrated by his knowledge of the aircraft, although this trait would largely be unsatisfied, so he'd have a need for adventure that he did not meet. We would see high conscientiousness. He paid for that second drink, even though the cat was already out of the bag, right? Everybody knew he was a criminal. Low extroversion. He was analytical. Mid-range agreeableness, consistent with an engineer and someone who could be selfish enough to commit a crime, but also have enough tender-mindedness to appear thoughtful. And we see he would have extremely low neuroticism. Now, of course, there are myriad other theories that are variations of these two, but no matter what theory I'm talking about, he did appear to have low neuroticism, and he appeared to be in a situation where no one missed him. There were no reports of a missing person matching his description around that time. So perhaps he was single, never married or divorced, and estranged from any family that would have expected him to show up on Thanksgiving. Although, of course, this is based on the idea that he did not survive. So this brings me to the last question: what happened to Dan Cooper? There have been a seemingly endless number of theories about Cooper. It's theorized that the FBI has investigated over 1,000 suspects. Many people have confessed to being Cooper, but many of those suspects had a significant dissimilarity from Cooper in that they were alive at the time they were being investigated. It's fairly likely that Cooper died on impact or shortly after impact because he was injured. He was never found because of a number of factors: the vastness of the search area, wildlife dragging his body away. He could have landed in the water. Somebody could have found his body and disposed of it, although I don't know why they would do that and never spend the money. They may have realized they couldn't spend the money. It could also be that he landed well outside of the search area. There are theories that the plane actually took a different route than originally thought because the pilot was flying manually. If somehow he did manage to survive the landing, it's hard to imagine he could make it out of the forest alive. If he survived the landing and escaped the forest, it seems likely that he lost the money, probably in the jump. There would be no reason for him to leave some of it behind and take the rest. That would be used against him. Also under this theory, he would likely be dead at this point because of his age. This case exemplifies how some criminals can be quite organized. He made a lot of mistakes, but he also managed to do something that had not been done before or since. I think he really just took everybody by surprise. Certainly in current times, it would be impossible for many reasons to replicate this crime, not the least of which is the no bombs in briefcases policy that has been adopted by most airlines. This case has also fascinated people for years, somewhat like the Zodiac murder case. Every detail of the case, including all the various suspects, has been examined thoroughly by many people. It's amazing how many suspects seemed really quite viable, how many people matched his physical description, were familiar with aircraft, understood airline procedures, had been a paratrooper or otherwise knew how to jump out of planes, had experience with explosives, had a criminal record, and could have been or were in the area at the time of the crime. Now, I know it's really just statistics and probability, but still it's amazing that so many people had all of those characteristics. It seems at this point, the case will remain a mystery forever. So it's pretty much considered closed by most any standard. So those are my thoughts on Dan Cooper, or D.B. Cooper. If you have any opinions and thoughts, please put them in the comments section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching. Certainly in current times, it would be impossible for many reasons to replicate this crime, not the least of which passengers that want to jump out of the plane would now have to wear a helmet. Not the least of which is that the flight crew will not let a passenger jump out of the plane without proper skydiving instruction. Not the least of which is the no clip-on tie policy enforced by most airlines. Not the least of which is the no smoking rule enforced by most airlines. Not the least of which is a surcharge that now applies if you want to jump out of the plane in mid-flight. Not the least of which is they now ask for identification if you want to jump out of the plane while it's flying. Not the least of which is that if a passenger wanted to make a trip by air for $20 these days, they would be flying on the wing. Not the least of which is that these days you have to bring your own parachute. Not the least of which is that these days you have to bring your own parachute. Not the least of which is that these days you have to bring your own parachute. They're just not handing out parachutes anymore.